identify November as approving the funding scenario. I wouldn't be surprised if it sort of rolls into December, but I think we're hoping to start the first of the year being able to move forward with the direction for the 21-24 STIP. When we had conversations last month, we really sort of talked about a little bit of the history between 18-21, and here we are at 21-24. And sort of that recognition, particularly as we think about transparency and accountability. Clearly, some of the work that we do on Off the Top, it wasn't as transparent as we wanted. So that's why, as we had the conversation last month, we recognized that these are the funding categories that we're probably leaning towards, and you all sort of gave the thumbs up on that. Obviously, we can make changes as we have these conversations, but this is really how we're sort of gearing the conversation. And I think this slide really sort of articulates that. As one who's been involved in the STIP, starting the Fix It, Enhance conversation, we had really sort of framed it around fix it, and then the different modes, and enhance, and then the different modes. And I think that we've learned over time, particularly with the funding that we're seeing out of House Bill 2124, that it probably makes more sense to sort of flip the discussion on its side. So look at it this way. So we'll be talking about highway. What are we talking about? Fix it. What are we talking about? Enhance it. So increasing capacity. And in the case of non-highway, sort of that similar discussion. I think it aligns a little bit better with really House Bill 2117. So here we are with sort of what we plan on talking about for August. The local government programs and the non-highway programs. I think on the local government side, and there's a diversity of programs within there, you're going to hear Mac really talk about. Most of this is required under federal law or agreements that we have with Association of Counties, League of Cities, and the Commission does have discretion in a couple of the programs. We're really going to propose sort of just some minor amendments to the funding levels, but not really propose any changes to the program structure. And again, I think Mac will walk through that. I think on the non-highway side, the conversation looks a little bit different. When we did the 1821, we really had very limited funds. House Bill 2017 really changed that. So I think you're going to hear Hal talk a lot about sort of the program structure that could be in place with the federal funding that we have there, as well as sort of safe routes to school and the bicycle and pedestrian program. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mac, and here's the little flipper for you.
Perfect. Good morning, Commission. Mac Land, Active Transportation Manager. So mine is, I think, a little bit more just information around what are the various areas that we support local agency projects with. Maybe in terms of Jerry's comment, not so much around a policy shift or a big funding ask in this area, more education and awareness, where I think Hal and Amanda both will get into more of kind of funding asks in some respects. So I think it's important to remind ourselves, what are we talking about? We have 10 MPOs in the state, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, 36 counties, and we work with 43 cities that are above 5,000 in population and 166 cities below 5,000 in population. And I think driving out here over this week, we're reminded constantly of the diversity of all those communities that we work with. And I know several of those members are in the room today and can speak to that better than I can. We're not focusing today's conversation around the state highway funds that cities and counties access or by law are distributed to them. We're the accounting arm of that process, receiving the revenue and distributing to them. But that's in statute, so we're not focusing on the state highway funds that they get through statute. What we are talking about is the programs that you, the Commission, have authority over in terms of identifying projects or funding levels, or programs that we have in the STIP and our long-standing traditions to share our federal revenues with cities and counties and MPOs. So just wanted to set that context. So I think this slide shows the complexity we have. And I'm going to walk through the programs on the left individually here in a second, but I think it's important to recognize who sets the funding level. Some of these are mandated by Congress, and we have no control over them. CMAQ, given that conversation recently, we don't control how much CMAQ money we get, for instance, but certainly this commission can put their direction to how we want to use that in the states. MPOs, depending on the size of it, really garners who controls that authority. Then as we move on down that list, you'll see on the right-hand side several key areas that the commission really has full control and ownership over. So I'll walk through each of those. Some of you may have seen this slide. To me, this is go back to Local Government 101 civics class in probably 10th grade. The relationship between the federal government and local government. And if you recall, the federal government recognizes states. They don't recognize local agencies. So we, ODOT, are often put in the middle of that relationship when we're dealing with federal funds. We still maintain stewardship and oversight of those funds. So regardless of what projects are funded or investments are being made, we have a role to ensure those federal programs are being met and the rules and laws and regulations are being met. It puts us in an awkward place sometimes. We use the analogy of who's driving the car. In some cases, we're holding onto the steering wheel with them. In other cases, we're in the back seat telling them, watch out for that curve. And in some cases, we'd love to not be in the car, but because of this relationship, we're forced to be. There's two documents that really describe how we operate with local agencies. On the left-hand side between FHW and ODOT, we have a stewardship and oversight agreement, which really dictates what our responsibilities as a state agency are in ensuring federal funds are being followed appropriately. On the right-hand side, we have a long-standing agreement with AOC and LSC, Association of Oregon Counties, League of Oregon Cities, and ODOT around the relationship between cities and counties at a programmatic level and several of the funding categories that we share. So I'll walk through each of these at a high level. So CMAQ, fresh conversation given the work of this commission over the last few months, and I'm reminded a year ago we were in Klamath Falls starting that conversation. So happy to be here today with that settled. Yeah. So we know where that's going for 2019 and beyond. Obviously, we just had that conversation with the eligible MPO areas and rural cities. They're going to own how to invest those funds, but obviously we narrowed down the eligible uses of those dollars. Just like our CMAQ conversation in the past, we've been fairly passive in that program. We've been fairly passive in several of our other programs. And I think with House Bill 2017 passing and the big A, I'll call it, the accountability emphasis coming out of that, I think you're going to see us bring some more information back to you over the course of the next 6 months or so around how we get clarity around accountability and expectations with cities, counties, MPOs, depending on these funding programs that we're talking about. So MPOs, it's an important aspect of the funding that gets shared throughout the state. This one is specific to project funding, so that's the new pedestrian bridge in Salem, the Peter Courtney designated bridge. That MPO in Salem used some of their federal highway dollars that they have control over to help fund that project. It was delivered by a certified local agency, so ODOT we had our hands off of it as much as we could and allowed the city to develop that project. Obviously one of substantial size and scope given all the federal requirements. Those funds, specifically something we used to call STP, and now the federal government has changed that into a rather long acronym, STBGP. I jokingly say it's because we already had the system transformation program with DMV, so they had to change it. And that's also transportation alternatives funding, so mainly active transportation-oriented projects that the large TMA areas, Portland, Salem, and Eugene, have funding. We don't control the funding that they get. We don't control the amount that they get. That's designated by federal law through Congress. We also have the agreement with AOC and LSC that we share funding with the 7 smaller MPOs throughout the state as well, and they control how to invest those funds. And I mentioned that we're still responsible for stewardship and oversight. That's about $35 million a year that we share with the large MPOs and about $5 million with the smaller MPOs. MPO planning funds, otherwise known as PL funding, annually this commission sees an action to distribute those funds to do planning level activities with each of the MPOs. We also cover the matching funds as part of those federal dollars for the MPO partners and essentially hold that funding flat. And so if we receive less federal dollars, we ensure that they maintain a level of funds that they can operate with. Obviously, a lot of work, a variety of different level of efforts being done with those dollars depending on the size of the MPO, but important to their program, but focused on planning level activities. Before I jump, on the MPO piece, I wanted to mention we have ODOT staff as a member of each of the MPOs. So we're on the policy board of each MPO. We don't have the authority of a veto power. We're a member just like anyone else in governing that MPO board. So sometimes I think we get in an awkward place of what's our role in dictating how those funds can be used. That's not our role. But once projects are funded, we clearly have to be involved in the delivery of those projects. And we're moving more towards relying on our certified local agencies to do the work themselves and getting them up to a place where they can deliver federally funded projects.
So remind me how much, this is, the planning money that goes to MPOs is outside of the $40 million that you were talking about previously. How much are we getting generally from the feds for this planning work?
Yes, so Commissioner Lohman, the planning funds are the PL funds. It's FHWA and FTA funds combined. It's around $5 million a year.
Okay, and then how have we allocated that? Has it been a formula, or, I mean, are we?
Yeah, so Commissioner Lohman, it's a little bit similar to the CMAQ conversation we had.
That's what I was afraid of.
Yeah, population driven with some other factors included in that.
Yeah.
So that brings me to a question in terms of the MPO funding. Are there areas in which, as we have this conversation, that we would maybe like to strengthen or tighten up?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
And I think that's the big A, the accountability piece around expectations, around obligations. So how timely are they using their funds, and what's our expectation as an agency and as a commission with this relationship that's a little bit different between the various sized MPOs. So I think we will be having that conversation with you later this year around what role you want to play in those funds. And I'll go back to why does that matter? Because as a state, if we don't obligate all of our federal funds, we lose them, or we don't have the ability to get more. And we've been very not lucky, it's been very strategic to go after more funds through redistribution, and we've been very successful in that every year.
So the only thing I was
Mac,
going to.
real fast.
Yeah.
The federal formula, has it always kind of just remained the same, or has it altered, and how often has it altered over the years?
ICT.
I'll turn to Travis. I think he's got a little more history on that than I do.
Yeah, generally, what we have seen, Commissioner Simpson, over time is all of the local funding categories have gone up in terms of the overall program funding. For example, the planning funds, I believe, went up in the FAST Act and MAP 21. Don't quote me on that because I don't have that series in front of me. But I can tell you the MPO funding for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program went up by something like 30% in the FAST Act. It was a massive increase in funding. And for the first time in MAP 21 in 2012, the MPOs received a chunk of the Transportation Alternatives Program. So overall, what we've seen is the funding going to the MPOs has gone up by something like 50% in the last 6 years since the FAST Act. So there's been a very substantial growth. Some of that, the Transportation Alternatives Program and the STP program, there is a direct federal formula that ODOT literally has no role in. The MPO planning funding, that is an area where each state receives an allocation and gets to determine how that is distributed among MPOs.
And has there been criteria or reasoning behind why the federal government has made those increases? Is it because the changes in the system or the needs? And I'm just curious about that.
Commissioner Simpson, that is more, I would say, subject to the vagaries of politics than necessarily any rational calculation. Now, I would argue that over time, the needs within Oregon's metropolitan areas has grown as their population has grown and congestion relief or congestion needs have grown and other modal needs have grown. So it does parallel, I would say, the need discussion, but it was perhaps more of a political decision by Congress.
And I think it was in 2012 or MAP 21 where the percentage increase for the PL funding for the MPOs went up from 1% to 1.5% across some programs. So that's where they saw it increase. It also happened to be the same time that every census is when they look at the MPO boundaries. Last census was where we got Grants Pass, Albany, and Milton Freewater, and that really led us. We did actually an 18-month, so it's a little bit more fun than CMAQ. Maybe we should have had a commissioner. We spent 18 months working with, I would say, my peers out of the MPOs, sort of agreeing on the formula because, again, the pie hadn't really changed size, and now you were slicing it with 2 additional MPOs. So we did work through that. The other thing that I was going to add on this is that, sort of at the same time, you guys are having conversations about accountability and transparency. Our federal partners, the division office, have expressed a lot of interest in the MPOs and sort of making sure we're mining the store correctly. So we've actually developed some MPO guidance, a guidance document. We have to go through self-certification every 3 years with the MPOs. We have a checklist for that now, as we do for a checklist for ourselves as a state, and that's something that we have to complete before FTA or Federal Highways will approve the STIP. So they're looking at that checklist as we speak right now. So there's been a fair amount of that work that's been going on sort of simultaneously. I will tell you that we support the MPOs in a variety of different ways. So obviously Metro has a lot more staff than the Albany MPO or the Bend MPO. We can support them. I know with my staff, we support them in the case of modeling. So we do a lot of the MPO modeling for some of our smaller MPOs. As we're thinking about all the performance measures that we're required to do now under the new federal regulations, as a state, we're bringing together the data, providing the information to the MPOs. So even though we talk about the PL funds, that's not the only support that we provide to them. It just looks different depending on the MPO.
No further questions on MPOs. I'll keep moving along. I think this program is probably one that gets the most excitement when we talk to cities and counties outside of the MPO areas. So we've provided an allocation of our federal funds to counties and cities above 5,000. That's that 36 counties, 43 cities. It's an annual allocation of funds. As Travis was alluding to increases in federal funding over the past, it's a percentage basically. So as we get more money in the state, we share obviously the same percentage, but a little bit more with those local agencies. We also offer fund exchange, and we've talked about that before. 94 cents on the dollar, we'll exchange those federal funds for state funds. That gets ODOT out of the car, if you will. That puts the local agency with the ability to control and own their projects and their allocation of funds. The local agency controls how they want to use these dollars, and I simply say as long as it's following state highway eligibility, state highway fund eligibility, so build a road, not a water park, we're okay. We've been in a 2-year pilot, expanding this program to local bridge and safety mainly, and using the same model that was established with Fund Exchange to state fund those other local projects. And we're feeling a tremendous benefit with that program with the passage of House Bill 2017. We're going to continue to pursue in that direction, and we'll be bringing a more formal policy conversation to you later this year to codify that direction. Likely through the next STIP cycle, and maybe we look at that every 2 to 3 years to look at cash flow and does it still make sense. I would tell you the local agency partners I work with, I think, are extremely happy with this proposal. Several of them in the room today, just giving them the ability to own and control their own projects, meet the state requirements, not have all those federal cables attached to it, and not have to come through ODOT's process for everything.
Oh, please go ahead.
So Matt, where does the 6%?
Yeah, good question. So where does the 6% go? Typically, we've said that's for our administrative costs. So as we exchange those dollars, what is the burden that's put on the agency on us to then take on the responsibility for those federal dollars? Other states have various, so I should mention there's about 11 to 16 states, depending on the time frame, that do fund exchange. Some of them do an 80-20, some do a 50-50. South Dakota does a 120%. I'm still not sure how they get to that. So we're kind of in the middle of the road with that, and it's a long-standing 94%. I think a lot of that may have been lost through the translation over the decades that we've been doing this. But we don't actually, get money out of that 6 cents. It's more in the mechanics of the accounting.
So I had a similar to Commissioner Brown in terms of, do we need to revisit the 94?
My personal opinion is we leave this alone. It's been operating well for a long time. I think as we expand it long-term into areas like bridge and safety in particular, that question has come up both internal to the agency as well as from our local partners. And I think that's what we're exploring a bit further now that we believe we have the cash to continue this a little bit longer term than just the pilot.
Great. Yeah, I wouldn't want to see it change. It's a fabulous program.
I think that's right, Madam Chair, but it's a legitimate question. I think we would be one to go back and validate the numbers right, because again, I will tell you, I validated it 20 years ago when I was the local government liaison with ODOT here. So we just have to affirm that that's a good business transaction.
Local bridge, this is about 26 million a year. It's based on federal funding allocations. There's a requirement that we fund certain off-system bridges, so things that are not on the federal aid transportation system. Think about, the bridge that maybe serves a handful of houses in a rural area, obviously critical to their community. Obviously big bridges, so some of the larger county or city-owned bridges in the Portland area, and then just our normal local agency bridges across the state. There's a tremendous amount of these, as you've heard before. This is also governed by the Local Bridge Selection Committee, so a coordinated effort between ODOT, AOC, and LOC to make recommendations on what projects to fund based on a lot of our bridge data that we currently have. This is one of the programs that we are certainly using the new pilot to state fund some of those projects. And I think since we're out east today for this meeting, I think this is probably one of the real big wins. When you think about the complexity of a bridge over the Willamette in downtown Portland versus a 25-foot bridge on a rural county road in Harney County, for instance, following all the same federal requirements is a little bit challenging and obviously cost prohibitive in some of those areas. So I think we're seeing a lot of advantages in this area.
How does seismic fit into that?
I believe, I'm certainly not the bridge expert, Commissioner O'Halloran, but I believe in the large bridge conversation, it certainly is part of that discussion around what improvements are they funding to support seismic. I think you've heard Paul Mather talk about the coordinated effort with Lane County and Tillamook County around looking at local roads serving as that seismic network, potentially different than the ODOT system. So it is part of their conversation. My sense is the need is still so great that they're still looking at how do they bring their local bridge is up to some sort of standard rather than seismic. Small cities, this is not necessarily a program in the STIP, but I think it's worth mentioning. House Bill 2017 made a dramatic change to this, made a 5 times increase from 1 million a year to 5 million a year. So those 166 cities I mentioned, we do not have fund exchange with them. We do very little local bridge or safety projects with them. So this is one avenue that we can fund projects in their communities. I generally call this the Pave 2 Blocks of road in a town program. It's been at $50,000 per project because the bar was set at 1 million a year. So that's expanded. It also requires the director to assign an advisory committee of member cities to help make recommendations on those projects. So we're working through that now. That's, I think, a big win for those small cities that we're helping to administer that. TGM, Transportation Growth Management, this is one area that you certainly can play in around setting the funding limits. This is ODOT funding planning efforts with local communities. It's a partnership with DLCD. An advisory committee walks through the application process and make recommendations on that. It's about $4.3 million a year now. And Jerry can speak more to this, but the funding's been fairly flat for a long time, and we're feeling a lot of need in that area. I think especially given House Bill 2017 and the focus on transit, safe routes to school, and other areas, I think that need continues to grow. So I think in the funding scenarios, you likely will see an ask in this area for a little bit more.
Matt, oh, sorry. Are the numbers that you're mentioning, are those annual? Okay, very good. I have the 1821. I'm just kind of cross-referencing of where we were, and I'm trying to add in my head, so.
Yeah, and I would just add, Chair Boehne, the number piece, not throwing too many at you, but just give you a frame. But when we come back with scenarios and the full allocation, I think that's where we'll get to some granularity on that.
Excellent, thank you. Please.
we provided some funding along with other agencies for work done in Joseph. Was that through TGM or was that a program that we no longer have?
So TGM, way back when, did do some work as a downtown plan for Joseph. So yes, so
Yeah.
that's sort of setting the stage for this.
Right.
So we do all types of different plans, sort of, and sometimes the emphasis changed. There was a while back an emphasis on interchange area management plans. So we just had our advisory committee meeting, a week or two ago, and the director was there. And what we're seeing is a lot of transit planning. So sometimes the needs change. What I was going to add to what Max said, so it has actually been since 2007 since we've seen an increase in this. So we've kept the TGM funding flat for the last 10 years. And we've seen, I think, most importantly, as some of these plans, particularly transportation system plans, the costs go up. So we're just doing less projects, right? So the funding cost of doing the projects has increased. And when we look at House Bill 2017 and just realize whether it's safe routes to school, whether it's transit planning, that we're probably going to see more need show up there. And as it is right now, we typically fund sort of 1 out of every 2 to 3 projects, so depending on what the request is. The TGM is so we have criteria and whatnot, and it's a grant program, so it's competitive. And these are usually where local governments have seen a need of something that they want to do. We obviously fund a lot of planning through our state planning and research, but that's where our region planners have recognized that they need to do some planning in support of projects that they see coming forward on the state system. So you'll see a lot of times a same plan, transportation system plan, can be funded sort of through 2 programs. But in SPR, it's ones that we as an agency feel are important versus the types of planning work that a local might feel is important. A downtown plan, a parking plan, bicycle and pedestrian plan, those types of things.
So when local areas are wrestling with putting together STIPs and they're putting together the 150% list, and those potential projects need some level of planning in order to figure out, what, at least roughly, whether they're feasible and what the costs are going to be. Where does the funding for that sort of early planning effort come from?
That is an excellent question, Commissioner Lohman, and I would tell you it's a gap that exists. We really do struggle with sort of that preliminary design, I think particularly for some of the bicycle and pedestrian work and safe routes stuff that Amanda is sort of charged with. We've tried in TGM, we get to a little closer when we talk about a circulation plan, but we've been really clear because that need is so great that we still keep it sort of in the planning focus. I think it was the ARA funds where we put a little bit of money into preliminary design. I don't have an answer for that, but it is one that we're paying attention to.
But the portion, the portion that we use for, what's the right word here, for modeling, that just comes out of sort of general planning money that has been
Correct.
allocated to ODOT, not to the local areas.
Correct. But that's mostly also at a larger scale, so it's not quite getting, again, we'll get sort of to the circulation, but usually some of the design questions, do they own the right-of-way? What are some of the fatal flaws that might be there? That isn't, none of the work that really comes out of, in a sense, my division. Can I fund that type of work?
All right.
So.
Thank you.
I was just curious as to how many of these potential projects are focused on like more pilot projects or like research and just ideas that are kind of just thrown on the wall. Are any of those kind of
No,
coming across
Commissioner,
this?
we have pretty established objectives and criteria for how projects can be approved. They get reviewed by our region staff and they get reviewed from our DLCD staff as well. There is a category for bonus points for innovation, but that's really as far as we take it. There is also, this is just the grant program. We do have code assistance, and we do have public outreach. So sometimes public outreach in particular is probably the place where we deal with some of, for instance, getting speakers talking about the relationship between transportation and health, smart growth, those types of things. So that's usually the venue that we do there.
So moving on, I got two more to cover with you. So arts, all roads, transportation, safety. Paul, I think, will talk in more detail about this next month as part of his Fix It conversation. But I wanted to mention this in terms of another program that we fund local agency improvements with. Jurisdictionally blind program, we haven't had it for that long. We're following the federal guidelines around that funding source that's specific to safety. And we split the funds between ODOT and cities and counties based on a data-driven approach. So I wanted to mention that as well. In the first round, we saw a lot of things around systemic improvements like roadway departure crashes, so putting up curve warning signs, delineator posts, et cetera. That's where we're seeing the value of state funding some of those in this pilot program, allowing a county, for instance, to go out and put up those delineator posts, those curve warning signs where they're out doing other work, rather than having to go through the engineering process of hiring a contractor and follow the federal standards. So that's just another area that we share funding with local agencies. Go ahead.
Just to remind the commission, $10 million was directed toward this program off the top from House Bill 2017. So another infusion and greater opportunity and greater reach for the safety investments.
The last one is the Immediate Opportunity Fund, or otherwise known as IOF. This is a partnership we have with Business Oregon. A partnership in the terms of we help fund it and they help tell us which ones are good projects. This picture is Newport. So this is the South Beach improvements that were made when the NOAA research vessel relocated. So obviously a big improvement. We don't fund a lot of what you would see on that picture. We fund just the transportation roadway improvements of it. So this program is really in support of economic development using state highway funds. We're not going to be actually building the building, but we're going to help get the road to the building. This program is about $3.5 million a year. It's been pretty flat for a long time, but what we've seen is over time the needs kind of go up and down. We've never expended or overexpended it. Some years during the Great Recession that we recently went through, not much coming in to that program, which sometimes is a little counterintuitive. I know for me, thinking about it, you would expect more or greater need for it, but in reality, not much economic development is going on during the recession period. But as the economy starts booming right before the recession, we saw a record number of requests. And certainly all of those come to you, the commission, for approval. Business Oregon, in conversations with them, are looking at their categories of funding and maybe looking at some retooling. So I could potentially see a conversation with them over the next year or so around how the guidelines around this program are meeting their program needs as well. But that's an important program. We do agreements with local agencies, so they're on the hook, if you will, but in partnership with the private sector that may be developing that area. That's the end of my section. I think three things I wanted to leave you with. You're going to hear, I think, a little bit more of increased accountability. I've mentioned that both with our MPOs and our cities and counties to make sure they're using the funds in a timely manner. And I know we'll be coming back to you with that. Generally, we're keeping this status quo with the exception, I think, of TGM, which you heard a bit about. And then, of course, we're going to pursue that greater ability to fund exchange and state fund those projects.
So because we're going to move into non-highway programs and go sort of a different direction, just want to make sure if there's any other questions before we move on about all of the various local programs that Mac talked about. Okay, very good. All right. So now moving on to non-highway programs, just set the stage just real quickly, and then I'm going to really turn it over to Hal. We're going to end up really talking about sort of three areas. So Hal, as he talks about public transportation, talking the $43 million really around elderly and disabled and mass transit. Amanda, she talks about the highway fund, the $60 million you see there represents really the 1% for bicycle pedestrian as well as the safe routes to school. And then the discretionary non-highway is really the commitments that we have, whether it's at the federal level through our Transportation Alternatives Program or through the JTA. So you'll hear, again, more discussions on each of these individually, so. Turn that over to Hal.
Chair Boehne, members of the commission, I'm Hal Gard, I'm the administrator of the Rail and Public Transit Division. Transit's complex, the money is a complex picture. I'm gonna try to start at a fairly high level and then pull it down to some specific areas where the commission has an opportunity to weigh in. As you recall, I think just a couple months ago, the commission approved a large series of transit grants. And what we really do is we provide a coordinated grant program that puts a number of different types of funding together to be able to issue those grants. Public transportation in Oregon, it's funded by a complex mix of about 20 different federal, state, and local funding types. In 2016, the majority of public transportation funding came from local sources at just a little bit under 50%. Federal's about 30% total. The state in 2016 was 4.4% of the mix. The proportion of the funding varies pretty widely across the state. For example, the three largest transit districts, it's TriMet, LTD, and Salem-Kaiser, they received probably the largest chunks of federal funding as direct appropriations from the federal government. They are also the largest generators of local money. So of that pie, really three entities are receiving the majority of it. Many, and I would actually argue most, of the smaller service providers depend upon state and federal funds for most of their service. Challenges with federal funds is that they, depending upon the designated type, they come with a whole series of limitations. And those limitations really kind of stifle our ability to adjust our funding level to address particular needs as they come up. And one of those, for example, is bus replacements in order to keep the fleet in good condition. So, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. OTC, while you guys play a strong role in reviewing our formula development and our grant awards, another place where the OTC has discretion is determining a portion of the federal highway formula that the agency has flexed over to transit. For many years, the legislature and the OTC has tried to take some of those federal highway and formula funds and augment the money that FTA provides us, and along with the state transit funding. A lot of the money is used for bus replacements. The largest piece, that elderly and disabled funding, the $37.5 million, has historically, it's either been used for the bus replacements or to purchase service for operations. And I'm being kind of particular there. Actual operations money, FHWA doesn't allow that. They allow purchase service. FTA allows a portion of their funds to be used for operations, but the match rate is nearly 50-50. So it's purchase service in those areas. There's $6 million that's used to fund mass transit agencies. Those are large bus purchases, those very expensive large ones. And then we proposed of $15 million in the STIP for replacing buses that ODOT actually holds title to. And the majority of that 1,000 buses that we have title for, they're usually the smaller jitney-type buses that are used by small rural providers. And they don't have the same kind of life expectancy as some of the larger, much more expensive buses. Things are going to change, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the shift with the establishment of the State Transportation Improvement Fund. With that passage, it significantly increases the state's investment in transit. So from $37.2 million from the state in 2016, by the year of full funding, 2020, it's estimated to be nearly $114.8 million for that first full year. It's broken out in statute. 90% is dedicated formula to improve transit areas to appropriate recipients. There's a 5% discretionary amount, and that discretionary amount is placed there really to backfill the fact that transit's no longer eligible for Connect Oregon funds. And this fund, this is an important category because it's really there to be able to deal with those large one-time capital expenses like bus barns and maintenance facilities and transit centers, that type of thing. 4% is dedicated to inner city, and then there's a final 1% to establish a statewide technical resource center where we can help service providers meet their needs. Our implementation plan, I touched on a little bit yesterday, is fairly aggressive, and it calls for our first grant agreements distributing the 90% formula in January 2019, and then in July of 2019, we would have a process for distributing both the 5% discretionary amount and the 4% inner city. The commission has a role. You're required by rule to develop a process for review and approval for the 90% formulas. And the commission also needs to approve rules for procedures for appealing any grant that's rejected along the way.
Al, so the 5% discretionary and the 4% inner city, are those decisions, whose discretion is it? Does that ultimately come to the council for
It
to the
actually,
commission?
it's an OTC decision.
Okay.
In terms of how that money is allocated. The additional OTC direction is to help establish requirements for local advisory committees, including their composition, and also the criteria that must be included in the plans or the project proposals in which the advisory committees, they develop their plans for submittal to the OTC for final approval. Again, with the 5% discretionary and 4% inner city, we need to adopt the competitive grant program process. That's an OTC decision. And then we're to develop a report that goes back to the Joint Committee on Transportation by February 1st, 2020.
Of the first deadlines that you mentioned, which of those need to be by July of 18?
July of 18 is when monies are actually started to be collected.
So do we need the advisory, the rule for committee, or for the appeals, all of those other things that you mentioned,
We
be
need to-
back into July of 18?
We need to get those done
Very good.
before
Okay.
July of 18.
Thank you.
Exactly. So we're going to be busy. We're going to be bringing a lot of things to the commission. Yes, yes. Okay. While the State Transportation Improvement Fund is a significant injection of much-needed transit funding, it's only going to kind of scratch the itch until, by our estimate, 2028. And just on this chart, the blue kind of represents the current base level of services that are provided by the various service providers. And the red kind of reflects bringing all of Oregon communities up to a similar level of service. So it's kind of the criteria we use to establish what the current unmet needs are within the state. And the reason you start to see that line flatten out is because we continue to have a rising population, and particularly in elderly populations. By 2028, we're looking at nearly a quarter of the population being over 65 years of age. And then, yeah, quick math, when is that going to land? And then there's just a continuing rising cost of operations.
Quick, Hal, are there other charts that would actually provide kind of a projected outlook through 2045 of what the other modes would actually look like as well going forward? Like if you see a trend, obviously, and you're saying it's heavily weighted on population increases, but if those modes are being more, if the demand is there for public transportation, transit, how does that affect all the other modes?
That information is not, I don't have it readily available, but I'm sure we could develop it. Travis?
Commissioner Simpson, that's one of the questions that we're going to try to answer next month in September when we bring forward Paul talking specifically focused on bridge and pavement conditions over the next several decades. What you'll see is that there is going to be a lot of positive benefit from HB 2017 in terms of making our conditions better than they would otherwise be in the out years. But based on what the commission defined as the need in the investment strategy, HB 2017 does not reach that level. And so you will still see a long-term degradation of the condition of Oregon's roads, even though we'll be in a lot better shape than we would have been otherwise. So we're going to bring you something similar for highways next month.
So I look at these lines and, you know, nobody likes to see the red. But the one thing that I'm questioning, this is all how we've done things in the past. We're basing this on what we know, what we've done, and yet we only have 1% for technology. Should we really start looking at the future? I mean, and perhaps we're already too late, and we should have been doing this in the past, but 1% to me seems way low. If we're gonna continue on as we've always done it, as we've always looked at it, and maybe we need to really look at technology first and spend that 1% wisely and perhaps bump that and change that in the future, but really look at what's the art of the possible rather than projecting how we've always done business.
Commissioner Brown, I happen to agree with you wholeheartedly. Some of the areas where I think we have the most opportunity to really wring the most efficiency out of the system are technologically based. So general transit feed specifications is really just a open source software that any transit district can use to develop their schedules or service levels and display those. What we have statewide is a wild mix where we do have some agencies using those open source software, and that way we have access to it and we can kind of help folks from a statewide level start to align schedules and align stops and to work more efficiently. But many of the service providers have their own proprietary software. And so that opportunity to do that alignment is much more difficult. And of course, when an agency's made a large investment in some of those key tools, they're not super inclined to change right away. So I agree. And there are other softwares that we can buy and make available that have been used for statewide or for service planning in various areas. So it's a place where I think we can really get the most efficiencies.
And you started your conversation wisely that a lot of that money goes to the 3 largest agencies that we have. They're fairly well fixed on routes.
Right.
But you look at smaller communities that aren't so fixed that perhaps those demand-driven Uber-like connect and chain those requirements and really look at what is the demand and when, and is it every day, is it twice a week? You know, whatever that is for the elderly, especially going to medical appointments, how do you chain those trips? How can we start to look at what's the demand-based requirement
Absolutely.
in those rural, smaller communities? Because we can't afford big bus lines out there, nor do we want them, frankly. But I think we need to look at how do we use that money in smaller communities to affect better service.
Absolutely, and you know, those are the most expensive trips. Those rural medical trips or those long distance rural trips. But we've started working along those areas. We've been working with the regional solution teams. We had a pilot project in Deschutes County just to get medical service providers talking to transit service providers, so that there is at least a conversation happening that hasn't in the past, and an opportunity to start developing those chain trips and that type of thing.
Madam Chair, if I may, I think we spoke about another opportunity that I'm not sure is factored into this, but autonomous vehicle and the role that that would play in terms of, I will say, complementing public transportation as we know it. So again, there is a future out there. There's a foundation of what we know right now, but a significant, brave new world that I think we're just beginning to understand the benefits as well as some of the challenges that may come with that. So.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Director, in that Commissioner Lohman is challenging us with the public transportation plan that we'll be bringing to you all probably in the next year, within the next year, and setting the stage for that. and you hear about the pilots. The other is we have a steering committee internally around connected autonomous vehicles, and Andrew Dick, who is sort of one of our policy folks. Part of that is around just fleet in general, so it's not just a concentration on freight, but also public transportation as well. So I think we're trying to figure out exactly what that means and how do we engage in that conversation. But it's certainly on our horizon, and we're trying to figure it out.
And if I can, just to clarify that, it's not just 1%. I mean, the 1% number is what the legislature gave us or told us to spend out of that fund to be generated by the employee tax. We are looking at new technologies in a number of other areas as well. That was just to establish a technology center, related to transit. But as you say, I hope if we do a good job on producing this public transportation plan that we're working on, we will come back with a number of ideas, both for pilot projects and hopefully maybe even some real projects, now more than pilot and more than demonstration projects to suggest to the legislature to make our public transportation system more effective.
Yeah. I think the good news is that the legislature recognized the need for innovation and actually provided that dedicated source of funding that we're able to use for things other than just passing through grants to service providers, so I find that encouraging. There's still quite a few pressures with regard to kind of elevating the level of our system. This is kind of a double-edged sword, but the smoking age has been raised from 18 to 21. So we expect to see a reduction in the amount of cigarette tax that we receive for public transportation. And to drill down a little bit more, with our transit replacements, there was a significant investment in 2009 through ARA on vehicle replacements, and it scratched a huge need across the state, but that investment created what's known as the ARA bubble. And all of those vehicles that were purchased new in 2009 are now starting to get to the end of their use life. So our key performance measure, which is reflected also as that's a legislatively directed key performance measure, is also the federal performance measure that our public transportation fleet has about a 60% level of in good or fair condition. So we reached that from 2009 up and through 2014. The trend starts to decrease. And so in the 1821 STIP, we had proposed $5 million a year for vehicle replacements to try to move that line back up towards that 60%. That's our base level. But just projecting out, it looks like we would need an additional $63 million a year out past 2018 to kind of maintain the quality of our fleet. So really, that's the state of our situation.
So before we move over to bike ped, any other transit questions?
Question about you said a number of those small buses are ODOT owned. And are they considered part of our fleet for the purposes of the fleet analysis that has to be done according to the 2017?
No, we own the title. We keep the
Yeah.
title because we provided the vehicle to the service provider.
Right.
But we don't include that within that kind of overall DAS fleet. They're part of the individual service providers.
Okay.
Surplus work.
We have to, if it's, say it's the end of the bus's cycle, we'll go out and do an assessment, and it can be taken out of service either because of just miles or just state of poor repair. There's a number of criteria. If we establish those, then if we used FTA money to buy that particular bus, they allow us to surplus it and take it out of service.
All right, interesting.
Okay, good morning, Commission. For the record, my name is Amanda Peets, Program Implementation and Analysis Manager. So I'll be talking to you today about bicycle and pedestrian needs and issues. So starting first off with kind of the foundation for bicycle and pedestrian funding in the state of Oregon. Oregon passed a landmark bill in 1971, often referred to as the Bike Bill. It's called up there ORS 366-514. Among other things that bill does for biking and walking in the state of Oregon, it requires the state, counties, and cities to spend at least 1% of state highway revenue on biking and walking improvements. So that $60 million number that you saw earlier, that is ODOT's share of the 1%. The 1% that we've traditionally got or projected out to 2022 and beyond increases with House Bill 2017 because the overall revenue coming in increases. And then we get the Safe Routes to School funding off the top of that amount in the amount of $10 million a year until 2023 when that increases to $15 million a year. It goes out into perpetuity. I'll be coming back to you next month to talk a little bit more about the Safe Routes to School program. The legislation itself was fairly broad, but gives the commission the authority to set the program design, including considerations of what goes to the state system, local system, what's the process used to select projects, some of those kind of things. We'll have a high-level discussion about that next month. But that is the full amount there that is shown that would show up in the statewide transportation improvement program. So I know Paul Mather has come to you in the past and shown you kind of some comparison charts for what was in your investment strategy to what came out in House Bill 2017. So I plan to do the same here with bicycle and pedestrian. 3 categories that we really talked about in the investment strategy, the first being on-road investments. So the level 1, that moderate additional need, was assessed at about $20 million per year, focused on connecting to schools and to public transportation. What we got out of the legislation was a focus on connecting to schools, those Safe Routes to School investments, which again, it's that 10 million and increasing to 15 million. When you add in the match requirements of 20 to 40%, then it gets us up pretty much for what that first level ask was. There still, though, is a remaining need, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm going to jump down to the outreach and education piece because that is kind of that focus on Safe Routes to School. So Safe Routes to School programs tend to include 2 parts. One is the infrastructure side, making safe connections, safe crossings. The other tends to be this education and outreach side. So working with students on understanding the rules of the road, safe practices, making them comfortable with walking to schools. There's other programs that are newer like a walking school bus where parents get a group of kids together that walk to school so they feel safer. So they're very important programs across the state of Oregon. Those programs also fund Safe Routes to School action plans where the school boards themselves think about the needs within the district and identify some of those infrastructure improvements. So that program can be important too for how we fund the infrastructure side of connections to schools. We pull the $6 million need number from the Safe Routes to School network assessment, and what that reflects is reaching every student in Oregon graduating from elementary school with some level of safety education. What we got out of the bill was no money dedicated towards that education and outreach side, so there is that remaining gap then of how do we think about that. For the off-road side, in the investment strategy that was described qualitatively, not quantitatively, further work on that component as we were talking to the Oregon legislature about things. We had talked to some of our community partners and others in the region about what their off-road system needs are, and preliminary estimates of what's in transportation system plans and some of their high priority efforts are several hundred million in needs. So there certainly is a need there for those off-road paths, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So starting with the on-road system, being me and having the background in planning, I thought I'd focus on the statewide plans that you've adopted and some of the policy framework that you've set there, and trying to think about, instead of looking at kind of a peanut butter approach for bicycle and pedestrian investments, let's have some focus and let's align that with a policy direction. So there's some good policy set in the Oregon Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. So for the on-road side, one of the top priorities set, and this is policy 8.2A, Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan, And one of the top priorities is making critical connections. And your investment strategy talks about particularly to schools and to public transportation. So again, out of the funding bill, we do get some safe connections to schools, some funding dedicated towards that. We might want to think about how we can leverage those investments and be smart and strategic about those. And then the public transportation side, with the funding that Hal discussed for House Bill 2017, how do we leverage that for those first and last mile connections? Those are critical to reaching public transportation services. Not only to reaching those services, but there's a potential to help reduce costs for public transportation providers. An example of that is demand response service is very costly. It's service that goes and picks up people that might be disabled and not able to access what are fixed route services. But if we're able to make some of those first and last mile connections, those can increase their access to cheaper transit services and thus reduce overall costs for transit agencies. So there's a lot of opportunity to leverage those investments there. So that might be a focus area of some of that 1% funding shown in the previous chart. For the off-road side, Connect Oregon, so in House Bill 2017, there's a bike excise tax that can bring money into Connect Oregon. There's other potential funding sources that can come in there, and then 7% of what might be available for Part 2 of Connect Oregon funding. Really, it changed the framework for off-road investments for biking and walking in Connect Oregon because it focuses it on only those that serve a commuting function. As we developed the statewide bicycle and pedestrian plan, we did a lot of research on off-road paths to try to say, well, what serves a regional need or statewide, has a statewide benefit, and which serve commuting functions. What we often found, like on the Bear Creek Greenway, is it might have started as a recreational investment, but then becomes a big commuter route. So it's hard to distinguish between the two. But we were able to create a policy in the plan for what we call regional paths. And those are the routes that we thought met criteria that best fit that commuting function. And there's others that then become excluded from that. So you saw the Wallowa Lake connection and talked about that this morning. That probably would not fit under the regional paths policy and that criteria. So then one of the gaps then is how do we support some of those recreational trails and paths when Connect Oregon then is not a source available for those funds. Moving on then to outreach and education. So I mentioned the gap earlier of safe routes to school, education and outreach. Right now, you all put $500,000 per year into Troy Costellis's Transportation Safety Division budget for safe routes to school, outreach, and education. That really is one of the only funding pots in the state for these types of investments. And you could have a consideration if you want to put more towards that. I think the other opportunity is transportation options, and I'll talk a little bit more about that program in a minute. But transportation options providers are trained professionals that often work with school districts then to provide that safety training, that outreach, to do planning efforts with them. So those are the boots on the ground across communities that are really familiar then with the local issues and have those relationships built with the school districts. So considering additional investments there might be on the list.
I have a quick question. So will you be offering a recommendation in terms of, or maybe some options if we were to invest more than the $500,000 that's been identified now?
Correct.
Okay, excellent.
So I think focusing on transportation options, as I mentioned, there's an opportunity to potentially consider more also in what we do to support transportation options in the state. So that's a program area within my shop that includes several different parts. We have consultant support to smaller communities to do planning efforts and connections. So in Bend, for example, we've worked with the Oregon State University campus that's coming in and thinking about how that's going to increase travel in the region and how do we look at the other options that are out there to help level that out. And then we, as I mentioned, give money to transportation options providers. So an example of that, Commute Options in Bend, they also serve a good deal of the state here in Eastern Oregon as well. and again, are those boots on the ground. So there's an opportunity to increase transportation options investments for both the Safe Routes to School education and outreach side, but also to leverage public transportation investments. Often, public transportation providers work with the transportation options folks to advertise a new service coming out. So if there's a new line that they create, they add service, weekend service, how do they get the word out to folks? The transportation options providers are the ones that tend to do those announcements, have the outreach for that. Transportation options providers also work with folks to understand how to ride the bus and some of those kind of things. So there's an opportunity to leverage what came out of House Bill 2017 with some of our existing programs by considering bumping those up. The other consideration of need in the agency is how do we meet our ADA obligations? Certainly a big focus area, not only to meet those requirements, but for overall accessibility across the state. So there is a continuing need there. You've made past decisions to set some funding aside for that, and that need certainly won't go away in the near term.
Before you go to that, this is probably a naive question, is a naive question, but thinking about the Wallowa Bike Trail, for instance, or this idea of creating a bike path alongside the rail line from Enterprise to Elgin, to what extent are we looking at non-paved recreational bike trails? I think of the towpath along the C&O Canal in DC is not paved. It's a great bike trail. The bike path around from Lake of the Woods up to Fish Lake is not paved. But it's a great bike trail, even for non-mountain bikes. And I'm just wondering if there are ways that if we could establish some of those bike trails without maybe ideal conditions where you might like to have them paved. Is there a way we could do more with less money?
Sure, I think using the Wallowa Lake as an example, I know I talked to the local planner here who did that planning effort around and was thinking of creative solutions, even thinking about boardwalks or what other options might be available with limited space. How do you help to facilitate that without maybe the ideal facility? I think within that, we still have to consider our accessibility requirements and how we meet that. But I think there are other options that certainly we're looking into, and I think a great concept.
I would just add, Commissioner Lohman, Oregon Parks and Rec Department, we transfer a little over $1 million a year to them in Transportation Alternatives Funds, which funds their recreational trails program. And that's historically been more of the kind of gravel path work. So a number of them, if you think about the gorge, access to waterfalls, et cetera, some of our funding has been used for that. So I think that's also a gateway place. And those, I think, trail organizations are well aware of that and plugged into it, but that's another place that, while the commission doesn't play a role in that, we do share some of our federal funds by requirement with parks.
And another source of funding can be the Federal Lands Access Program, too, that funds those types of paths.
And I would suggest that we look, yesterday we brought up fiber optic as being something that limits us in this area, probably in other areas too. When you put in fiber optic lines, often they'll use the little trenchers, but if they use wider trenching opportunities and perhaps linking other pipeline systems, it leaves a pretty decent path that all of a sudden can be just what Commissioner Lohman discussed, where it's gravel at the time, fairly easy to pave or not quite pave, because you can do all kinds of things with chip sealing and others where you're not doing full depth paving. But we need to get past doing it the way we've always done it and leverage other opportunities and say, wow, what if a floating bike path? Oh, we'd never do that. Well, we have floating bridges in other states. So I want us to expand opportunities, and sure, one of those is going to be the totally crazy idea that you would never ever do. One's gonna be one that you'd think, wow, never thought of that. But that's the one you will do and be successful. And we can do some things and combine funds and look at opportunities. Thank you.
Great.
Mayor Sands, I saw, did you have a, if so, I do need you to come on up, but you're welcome to join us if you have a comment. Yep, he had a quick comment.
I just wanted to answer the.
Please join us right over here. We do have to have you on the microphone, though, so that the folks that are joining us that are not here in the room have a chance to hear your comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer Commissioner Lohman's question about materials used on bike paths and the Rails with Trails project. It will be mainly crushed rock. There was some discussion of paving, say, a half mile outside of Joseph and maybe a half mile outside of Enterprise for people that maybe in wheelchairs, et cetera, or elderly could use that portion. But the majority of the trail would be a type of crushed rock that compacts down and, as you say, gives a really good surface for bicycling.
Good. I know part of the Bear Creek Bikeway, there were small portions of it that are gravelled and partly to deal with the heaving problem from tree roots. And it works fine.
Right.
And to Commissioner Brown's comment, I think I've mentioned this before, but there's a long-term plan that the county has in Jackson County as we begin to pipe the irrigation ditches to turn those into bike paths, which would be a phenomenal addition. Think about that all around the state, what you could do in terms of bike access if we were able to do that.
Build support for piping, too. All right, thank you.
Great. Well, I get to take this home. For the record, this I'm Travis Brower, the Assistant Director at ODOT. And what we'd like to do is kind of walk you through what we would propose for the Commission's consideration. A fairly light proposal without any numbers. What we want to do is get your sense, based on what you've heard today, based on what you know of HB 2017, based on what you know of needs across the transportation system, are we bringing you the right target categories for this non-highway funding? So in the near future, Amanda and we'll work together to come up with a proposal around the $60 million in state highway fund dollars, how we use that money that has to be used on the road to hit specific priorities. And then we would like to bring you today this outline for targeted categories for the discretionary and on-highway funding. This includes both the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program, which is the old Transportation Enhancements Program, basically used for trails and paths, as well as the money that was set aside in the Jobs and Transportation Act for additional non-highway investments. So a total of at least $51 million for 2022 to 2024. My apologies that we're toggling back and forth between annual and STIP categories. When we actually bring you a full scenario, you'll see it in a little bit more comprehensive manner as a 3-year number. But we are talking about a 3-year number for this amount here. So let me walk you through what we would propose as the categories. First, a couple months ago, Chair Boehne asked us to bring the region managers into the conversation, make sure we understood what the needs at the region level are for investments in the STIP. And one of the key things we have found from our region managers is they really need a place to go for adding non-highway elements, whether that's bike lanes or separated paths or transit elements, to those basic fix-it or safety projects that are undertaken in communities. We have needs in those non-highway modes, and when we go into a community, we'd prefer to do a comprehensive transportation solution, not just a blow through town with paving and not address the other issues. Right at the moment, that's really hard to do because all of our fix-it categories are narrowly focused through our practical design methodology on go in and fix the pavement or go in and fix the bridge. What we would like to propose is, just like we did in the 18 to 21 STIP, have a category of non-highway, what we call leverage funds, where the regions can add those elements to meet the community needs, to meet those non-highway needs. I can't remember how much we put into the last STIP, but we think that there's actually a need potentially to significantly increase what we did over the last STIP so that we can meet those needs. The second area, as Amanda talked about, there is a significant need for off-road bicycle and pedestrian trails, whether that's recreational trails or commuter trails. These are oftentimes the routes that people feel safest on and don't necessarily want to be riding their bicycle along a state highway. Someone who's gotten hit by a truck on a state highway, I'll tell you, much rather ride on a off-road path. So in this case, we see a need to invest money in this area because HB 2017 really did not do a lot in this area. A lot of additional on-road funding, but the off-road funding is fairly constrained, through the Connect Oregon program. It's also important to note that we have our Transportation Alternatives Program funding that is generally directed toward trails under federal law. So we see that this is a place that we could put that money and meet some of that need for off-road trail investments. The third category that Amanda also talked about was the Safe Routes to School education. This is currently an area we spend over the course of the STIP $1.5 million through the Transportation Safety Division on education and outreach efforts that is really complementary to those increased investments on the road. Because we find that if you build new infrastructure but you don't necessarily find the education and encouragement activities funded, that they won't necessarily be used in quite the same way. So we see an opportunity, because HB 2017 did not increase the complementary education side, we could use some of the federal funds in the STIP to do that. We have a color of money issue with the State Highway Fund. We can't use those dollars, but we can use those federal highway funds, and would recommend that we increase that probably by a significant amount over what we currently spend there. Amanda also talked about transportation options. We currently spend about $1.5 million from that within the non-highway programs. Again, there's an opportunity to spend additional resources there and have that be a very good investment. This is the only place we can fund these programs. Again, we have a color of money challenge with the State Highway Fund, cannot use those dollars. And so as a result, the federal funds in the STIP are the most appropriate place for that, really the only place that we can go for those. Amanda also talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We will have significant requirements for undertaking projects as part of paving projects. As you know from looking at STIP amendments, anytime we're going through a community with a paving project, we're required to address all of the ADA ramps and signals that are triggered under our transition plan and under our settlement agreement. As a result of HB 2017, we'll be doing more pavement. So we're actually going to take care of a larger portion of the ADA need through those paving projects. And yet there are going to be some additional need for standalone ADA projects to meet our targets of getting through the system within the time frame required under the transition plan. We don't know what that number is yet. Some of it is going to be calculating how much we can get to as part of the paving program. But we do know that we're going to have to use some funding source, whether it is from this discretionary non-highway funding, whether it's the 1% set aside, or within the Fix-It program. We're going to need additional money. So this is sort of a placeholder that we will be bringing you a dollar figure in that regard. Then the last category is bus replacements. When you look at the overall public transportation program, the commission is in charge in the STIP of a fairly small portion of that. And yet we do have new FTA performance measures that are also incorporated into our key performance measures around bus condition. The new statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, the STIF, is one that will provide a significant infusion of resources for public transportation. Some of that will be used for new vehicles, and yet the expectation is most likely most of that money will go into service enhancements. Now, service enhancements require some vehicle replacement, and yet with the chart that we showed you earlier of the condition of our buses, we think that there is a legitimate case for some additional continuing funds going from the STIP to address this particular need. So before we put numbers to these, we want to get your feedback about whether these are these right categories, whether there are other needs you see. And so I'll take a pause and allow for any comments or questions about what this looks like.
To me will be, what impact will we make if we add in different categories? So what would we be buying? Not necessarily project specific, but we're moving toward a certain level of investment that we've been needing to do. We go from what would be a 20% investment given one number in a category to now we're really making some headway if we keep on that path. The The bus replacement piece, I want to mine that a little bit more. I understand, that we're going for expansion as well, but I think there was, for many, the assumption that that is where you would go to get some of that bus replacement funding. So I'd want to look at that one a little bit more as well.
Commissioner Boehning, Helen and I have talked about that. We would expect that as part of the rule, there would be some component related to asset management. Because we don't really want public transit providers to go spend all their money on new service and then turn to ODOT and say, hey, where
Yeah,
are
where are
our
buses?
buses?
Yeah,
So
right.
there has to be some responsibility for that at the local level. And yet we do see that there could be a benefit of having some statewide funding as
Right,
well.
and I think it would be shame on us if we're looking at we'd be just calling it something different, but the ARA infusion of funding, we'd be calling it the 2017 infusion of funding, and we'll be 8 years down the road, similar to where we are, saying, well, wait a minute, now our fleet has aged, and now we need, so we may, I would like to have us move past that reality and maybe learn from that in a way that we use it differently. The safety piece, Amanda, that you brought up, is that captured here enough if in the category of the safe routes to school? Is that the, working on Troy's side, is that captured there?
Correct.
Okay, very good. Please, Commissioner Brown.
So thoughts with Chair Boehning's comments about bus replacement. Maybe we need to think about doing business a little differently with reconditioning. That goes back to kind of the fix-it side of our existing system. We don't want transit providers to run a brand-new bus to death. We would rather teach them to run the bus and do enhancements as we go and perhaps fix things along the way. And maybe there's a way to do that. That's, it gets a little dicey. I know it gets into the maintenance side rather than, it's the operational and maintenance side rather than new. And the other thing I think that's missing on this list is innovation. And I don't know how much you put toward that, because I'm not I'm an engineer, so I'm not really innovative. I have fun thoughts sometimes, but we're not always innovative as an organization. And I think we freely admit that, but is there some way that we can get help and have somebody help us with some of those things?
Yeah.
That'd be the only thing I see that's missing.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. That one of the questions we can think about is whether we fund innovation within these categories or as a separate category. So we'll do some thinking around that. We have funded some innovative programs in the past, oftentimes as a set aside within categories, but we'll do a little bit of thinking about that.
I'd just like to give an example of that. So within our transportation options program, we have launched this last year innovation grants, really targeted at getting the boots on the ground themselves to come up with new and creative strategy, increase the state of the art and the state of the practice, and really share that information with others. So we try to leverage, at least within the transportation options category.
And if I may, Commissioner, we have additional examples where we use some of our transit discretionary funds, where we actually do a selection process based upon statewide innovation, statewide process efficiencies. So we do try to target limited money when we have it into those areas where we can get a statewide uplift.
I would have to concur with Commissioner Brown and around innovation, primarily in related to non-highway uses that create a network that provides a lot more safety as it relates to pedestrian and bike traffic in close freight networks. I just know that it's creating this paradigm where both of those modes are almost like at each other's throats, and I'm trying to figure out how do we create a system that actually supports both of them to operate efficiently and safely.
Personally, I think I can't think of any more categories to add to this. It's a pretty good menu, it seems to me. I think as we talk about how to allocate the money that is available for non-highway projects, I think it would be useful to have the same kind of framework that we've used in our investment strategy. And I know to some degree you have already in some of these categories, but the notion of here's what we're spending now, here's what we think the real need, not the ideal, but what the real need is, and therefore what the gap is. I think that would help us figure out how to allocate money among these categories.
this is a question, because I don't know, and it kind of goes along with Commissioner Simpson was talking about and some other things. We do a lot of paving and horizontal work, which is great, but do we also include the safety portion of that with lighting and barriers and connections? Rail comes to mind, we have a lot of rail interaction, but are there the non-paving things that we could extend to some of these projects? And maybe we already do. Can we do more of that to get to Commissioner Simpson's comment and, things along those lines?
Yeah, Commissioner Brown, Paul can answer this question much better. Maybe we talk about this a little bit more next month. But under most of the federal programs, when you go in and fix a bridge or do paving, you are required to take care of the safety deficiencies, areas that don't meet the federal standards along that section. The one exception to that is we have a 1R program which is just a simple paving job, where the Federal Highway Administration has said, instead of investing money in areas where you don't meet safety standards but don't actually have a safety problem, you can spend more money statewide at addressing the actual highest priority locations. So if you've got a guardrail that's, it's not a problem, but it's technically not up to the current standard, well, you may have a guardrail somewhere else that actually is a problem that you haven't been able to get to. We'll invest the money in that guardrail that needs to be fixed as opposed to one that just doesn't quite meet the standard. There are a lot of other areas like that, with rail crossings and HAL's program, where we have a lot of that money. So we'll try to hit on some of that next month as well. The one area I will tell you can't avoid with the paving program is the ADA requirements. That is very clear under federal guidance now. You must do ADA even when doing that 1R simple paving work.
And Commissioner Brown, if I can just add on that a little bit, our grade crossing safety program is pretty marginal. We've got nearly 1,000 unsignalized crossings across the state. Usually an upgrade to signalize is about $750,000, but our federal infusion is only $3 million a year. So it would take us several hundred years to get around to upgrading all the rail crossings. So that's just we are rife with opportunity.
Also, hearing from the regional managers about flexibility in being able to make improvements as they see necessary as well, I think would maybe get to some of that. Okay, other comments? All right, do you feel that you have what you need from us?
Yes, on
Okay.
that, certainly, I think you've given us very good feedback that'll help us bring back more fleshed out scenarios and putting some numbers to this. Let me just, in closing, give you the sense of where we're going the next couple of months, and you can provide any feedback on that. In September, we plan to bring you two major topics. We talked about non-highway side today and local programs. We want to talk about the highway, particularly the fix-it needs. And as I signaled earlier, HB 2017 makes really significant progress in addressing some of our long-term challenges, and yet it will not fill all of the need on the highway side that you defined in the investment strategy. So our goal next month is really going to be to show you how the condition of the system will fare with the additional funding under HB 2017, and then talk about different conceptual scenarios of what the STIP may look like. We did this last time around. We kind of brought you some scenarios and talked about, should more go into fix-it versus enhance. We're going to do that next month and try to sort of put a sense of what the system condition will do. We're still running the numbers. I'll tell you, getting HB 2017 was the best thing ever, and yet it is complicating putting the STIP together in the sense we have to understand what the financial implications are, how that money flows throughout the system. We're in the middle of doing that right now and hope that in the next couple of months we'll have those numbers finalized for you. Next month, the conceptual scenarios we'll bring you, there are basically two basic ones we'd like to propose. One is a base case. You heard us today walk through what we would expect for local government programs. We walked through the non-highway programs. We're going to put those into a scenario along with basically looking at what we did in the 2018 to 2021 STIP around fix-it versus enhance for the highway side, and then add in the HB 2017 money. So as you can imagine, since HB 2017 actually put most of the discretionary funding, or almost all of it, into the fix-it programs, bridge and pavement, and then some safety funding, that will be heavily focused on fix-it. And so we'll bring you that and show you what that does to the system condition. Then we'll provide an alternative scenario that will put a little bit more money into the enhance categories and maybe a little bit into some of the non-highway, just to give you a sense. You can sort of see if you toggle those up and down, what does that do to the system condition? And so we want to give you that opportunity to look at, where do we focus our funding? The commission has made the decision in the last couple of rounds, we're going to put most of that money into Fix-It, and yet we want to give you that opportunity to take a look at those different scenarios. So we'll bring you back those, then the feedback you provide next month will help us develop some more granular funding scenarios in October. And what we would plan to do is bring you those funding scenarios, as we talked about yesterday at lunch at that workshop. We'll bring in the ACTs and really have an opportunity to have them provide some feedback. What we'd like to do is we're going to sort of go to the ACTs right now, give them a sense of where you're at on the STIP process, and pose some of those bigger picture questions about the mix between Fix-It and Enhance and where the non-highway needs are in their communities, and then give them some time to chew on that, come back to the October workshop well prepared to be able to engage in that discussion with you. And that will then help us get to November with a scenario.
Quick question, as we heard a lot earlier in Mac's presentation mentioning obviously MPOs and everything, and I'm just curious if their input has any value or any importance as it correlates with, since they're the planners, and a lot of this stuff is all interconnected in that October discussion.
We have worked to ensure that we're engaging the MPOs at a deeper level through this process, but that's something we can engage with you about whether we bring them formally around the table in all this. It would have to be a very big table.
And I think we do have an opportunity in front of us to look at some of the, how to strengthen that program. So I'm kind of looking at MAC of a round 2 of the CMAC discussion, but I think we have a responsibility to have that conversation and to be accountable both from an ODOT side and an MPO side. I think it's a responsible thing to do, so.
And certainly, we have ACT members that wear 2 hats, so that they represent the MPO at the same time that they're sitting on the ACT. So they're probably thinking about both parts of the equation.
Excellent. Okay, let's just take a couple minutes and then we'll come back together. We'll change out the panel. about the management review, implementation, and procurement process. So, Mr. Gebhardt, am I turning it to you? All right, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, Chair Boehne and Commissioners. For the record, Bob Gebhardt, Chief Administrative Officer. We were talking last night, Paul and I, and we talked about the disparity of experience. So he says he's been in front of you 200 plus times, and this is my first time, so we'll have a little fun with this. I wanted to, again, enter into a discussion with you and then seek your approval or acceptance of the monthly progress report on the management review implementation. And I'll talk to you today about 2 of the 3 work streams that we wanted to bring information to you and give you status of. The first of which is in procurement. Item number 3 in the DAS recommendations per the management review called for DAS to Department of Administrative Services to convene a work group that would spend some time looking at contracting processes for highway projects across the full platform from the design to implementation and delivery, and convene a cross-functional group, so to include industry professionals, outside ODOT agency professionals, and other folks from the DOJ and other stakeholder groups. So we met with them last month, and DAS has assigned a project manager and has contemplated and put forward a high-level project plan that we'll go over real quickly here today. They contemplate two different groups or subgroups within this project team, one of which would be a research team, and that will include a good number of our procurement professionals in informing and giving work product to for them to review. Other research team members would be folks from other agencies to help inform the overall public contracting process. And then, let me see. Pardon me. And then just bringing together work product from ODOT Procurement Office to review and look for themes and opportunities to then present to a review committee. The review committee would include high-level professionals, DOJ members, and other stakeholders, to include potentially DAS Director Katie Koba or Chief Administrative Officer for DAS, Brian DeForest at this point. So that, and the timeline and vision to do the work, they're now recruiting potential committee members for both groups. And invitations are out, and we expect those spots to be filled by the end of the month, to then have a kickoff of the project in a formal way in September. The research body of work is envisioned to take place over September, October, and November, wherein the research group will then bring recommendations forward to the review committee to contemplate and think about putting together in final form in December and January for eventual presentation to the commission and the department by the end of February to meet the March 1st deadline. That's really an overview of where we sit today. I think I don't have any idea that people are struggling to get to meet these timelines. There are commitments to, and like I said, invitations are out. We're waiting on those responses at this point in time.
Just one quick comment, you probably already thought of this, but after being on the audit committee just for the last couple of months, I'd suggest you look at some of the audits that have been done, some of the things that have already come out, and some of, beyond their recommendations, really what was missing. What did we not get to ahead of time? Because I think we've looked at some of those contracting procedures, and we've looked at things that probably we should have caught, and maybe we did, we just didn't talk about them. So find ways also not only to change procedures, but how do we talk about it in the future so that we continually improve? And I think this goes also to our continuous improvement group and some things that we can do within the agency, but I think that would help with this process, because again, I'm sure these aren't things that are new, even when we find them in audits, but we probably should have corrected previously. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Brown. I'd also add that in parallel to this work, the agency's been involved in ongoing work in improving our internal process. You know, again, this work stream seeks to establish clarity of roles and responsibilities across the whole process of procurement that begins with a statement of work and a project envisioned and then being let, a statement of work that then goes all the way through the contract management process. And yesterday, of course, we had a little bit of commentary around, as Commissioner Lohman raised, you're going to do 70% more outsourced work. That's a different management requirement. It's maybe even a different skill set required to manage that external workforce. And so we've got some skill building to do, some definite pursuit of clarity as to those roles and responsibilities. And that's what we're seeking to do in parallel within the agency, just as much as we'll get as recommendations that come out of this work stream.
Go right ahead, please. Commissioner Lohman, then Commissioner O'Halloran.
I'm struggling with this issue for the city of Ashland. We really need to revise our contracting procedures and make them much more efficient. When I was with the Port of Portland, we undertook a significant business process improvement program aimed primarily at our contracting process that made significant strides in eliminating duplication and sort of sending a contract or an RFP or whatever back to somebody else who reviewed it once, and then you end up with a lot of circles. And I'm assuming and certainly hoping that this process will work on not just sort of transparency, but also internal efficiency and efficiency in working with our local folks when they're involved in our contracting.
Yes, Commissioner Lohman, absolutely. And there's natural tension between this push for efficiency and then the risk management piece that was alluded to yesterday. And that's, you just live in that space, that tension is constant. But we have conversations ongoing with all points within that value stream, or that process, if you will, to include the DOJ. House Bill 2375 out of last year's session gave us a few more things to do to get contracts done at a certain threshold and above. We're talking with our DOJ partners about the very real opportunity that exists in House Bill 2017, but also challenging folks to think outside the box as to whether or not embedded resources might be necessary for people to come alongside, be part of the business, and understand what's coming. Take a look at a pipeline view that not just looks at the project pipeline, but then what do we have as a support requirement that sits below that to make sure people are armed up and ready to go, and starting with enough lead time so that we can get good work product into the machine at inception, and not have as many feedback or redundant loops that you're alluding to.
Bob, thank you for this. And when you look at that, so outside, so is DAS the only people outside of ODOT that are involved in this?
No, Commissioner O'Halloran, I think we were talking to a couple of other state DOT procurement people. I think we've talked to the state of California, and there's at least another state or two that they've at least sent out a request for interest and trying to seek somebody to come in and give us an outside view. We've also got the DOJ folks, and we've got other procurement officers within the state in the larger agency settings where they have similar tensions, certainly not spot on with ours, but certainly same kinds of complexities in dealing with these contracting issues.
And so we're following on the management review, which was initiated prior to House Bill 2017 being passed. So is this work consistent with the mandates and requests of the legislation?
Yes, I believe it is. And again, I think the call to action by the legislation is to make sure that we're armed and ready to go and prepared with whatever contracting instruments are going to be necessary to facilitate the movement of the business.
Yeah. Okay, good. I would just say make sure that the commission is involved in this, because I think that the notion of the legislation is to make sure that it's not just ODOT looking at ODOT, that there's some validation from an arm's length to give it credibility. And I think I'm just going to say, make sure we do that as we go forward. And I think you've got DAS to do that, but I think we just have to make sure that we have credibility in the auditing and in the reviews, and it's really about checking ourselves and making sure that it's there. So that I just say it more as a comment, not really a question, but as we move forward, this is lots more to do as we implement. So anyway,
Yes,
thank you.
point well taken.
And I would just underscore that I think in order for us to execute on what's been given within House Bill 2017, we will have to think differently about how we are contracting and really streamline that process. I think we have been, and for many reasons, risk adverse, not just the department, but our sister agencies who help us get through contracting. We need to be able to meet the need both on a local level as well as the state. We heard yesterday about some of the contracting challenges. This is DAS-led, if I'm understanding correctly. Is that true? Okay.
Correct.
Do you mind going over a little bit more in terms of, because that stakeholder piece and learning where are those barriers within the contracting and procurement and kind of project management, some of those challenges that we know exist, maybe they've come up in audits or whatnot. Would you mind going over that stakeholder engagement piece a little bit more in terms of, do we have all entities of ACEC? Do we have AGC? Do we have, folks that are, we have partners that help us get to that finish line. Are they engaged at a level that you feel comfortable? If not, how do we get there? And then second, although it's DAS-led, would the committee be open to having a commission member should we choose to request that? So those two questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair Boehne. In responding to Commissioner O'Halloran, I did fail to mention ACEC and AGC are folks that have been solicited for potential parties to these committees.
Have you been able to land someone?
I have not
If
received.
not, we can help.
I have
Okay.
not received an affirmation yet, but I expect to by early next week. And if they're struggling at all, I'll be sure and reach out.
Yeah, I think we just make that happen.
Yeah,
So,
no, I think, Madam Chair, know that Paul and I met with the ACEC leadership, and this was a topic of conversation. They stand ready. They'll get a name. But we have been working this issue for a while. This is not new. This is not unique to the Department of Transportation. Just a couple issues, because I think it's been mentioned now both days here. We all struggle with the outcome of a healthcare IT project that swung a pendulum of oversight and legal scrutiny to where we are right now, okay? Now, that's an external world, and we will have to deal with that because there's statutory direction on that front. But we're working with our partners, both at the Department of Administrative Services and the Department of Justice, to say, listen, we're good clients of yours. We actually do what we say we're going to do. So as these disciplines that were put in place for a challenging situation, here's how we are managing risk, and it is managing risk now. It is an attitude that we're trying to bring to the department and share with our council, that we do not live in a world void of risk. Risk avoidance is not the strategy. Risk management is the appropriate strategy, and it should be predicated upon the exposure to the agency. And let's have the professionals have that conversation. We've got some work to do given the shadow of Cover Oregon. Just to be blunt, that's what caused this. The second thing is we've looked internally, and I think Bob mentioned this, and it goes back to the initial scope that we receive. So the importance of the procurement conversation and removing redundancy, too many bites at the apple, a sequential approach rather than a concurrent approach. We're looking at all that. But to be very honest with you, it actually goes to the initial intake. And we have to do better as an agency working with our folks, working with the consultant community, working with local government to ensure that the scope that we initially put forth is sound. Because any change in that, even a little change, sends it back through the process. So our efforts to date have been focused on, let's tighten up that initial scope to make sure we know what we want. That will allow us to move through the process as we continue to focus on the process and look for those streamlining and simplification issues. Because when you step back far enough, this is all about delivering projects in a shorter window period of time. And that's a significant issue. And that really was the conversation with the legislative folks. How can we deliver these products in a more expedited fashion without lowering any of the disciplines that you need to do to ensure that we are delivering a viable project here? So this is, again, a pretty significant conversation that reaches into the agency, but has huge implication to the way we do business with many stakeholders. So We're going to stay on top of this, but please know that we have been working, doing some spade work because it has been a challenge in the past, and we're aware of that.
Just wanted to correct the chairman. I think what we heard yesterday was an echo of, I think it was a Shakespearean character in Merchant of Venice who said the solution to this problem is kill all the lawyers.
Happy to, any other questions in this regard, or I can move on to the second work stream. All right, thank you. Let me see if I can get this. So the second of the three that we're here to discuss includes, in the management review, there was a recommendation, and DAS recommendations number 4, which asks for some efficiency oversight or efficiency analysis done in our fleet and facilities areas. We've broken that into 2 separate bodies of work, and Paul will speak on fleet. I'll give you a quick overview of what we're doing in the facilities space. A few weeks or a couple of months after these recommendations came down, the governor's executive order 1707 came out, which called the whole state to action on efficiency optimization in all facilities across the statewide facilities footprint. So what I've done here in this graphic is we've just we look at the parallel work streams. The lower part is the work that we're embarking on. The upper part is what 1707 calls for, and they're quite in sync with one another. This particular body of work, we are just about at the tail end of an RFP to get a consultant on board to help us with analysis of our total facilities footprint per the recommendations. And additionally, we want to lay that next to our seismic up corridors and requirements and upgrade in the delivery of House Bill 2017 to make sure, while that wasn't called for specifically, we want to make sure we're in sync with what's envisioned for delivery of the project portfolio and making sure that all facilities that sit along those, especially in those corridors, those at-risk corridors, we want to make sure our facilities are top-notch. And so we're going to ask for that level of analysis to be done as part of this body of work as well. But we're just about done with the RFP. We expect to have a consultant on board in September and launch officially into that body of work with a delivery date expected by July 1 of next year so that we can enter into any budgetary conversations that will be required as part of our 1921 legislative budget build.
Do we have questions on this particular streamline? No, it's great.
Madam Chair, member of the Commission, Paul Mather, Highway Division Administrator, just give you a quick update on the fleet side of the work we're doing to respond to the recommendations from DAS and the McKinsey report. First, just start with a little context around just what is our fleet and how much fleet do we have. We have over 6,000 pieces of equipment in our fleet. The vast majority of those are non-motorized, so they are the plows, they're the sander inserts, they're the various aspects of our fleet. When we look at our motorized fleet, when we think of our fleet, that's mostly what we think of. We put them into 3 different categories: our light, medium, and heavy fleet. Our light fleet are sedans and our vans and those type of vehicles. We have about 800 of those in our fleet. Our medium fleet are what we call our 1-tons, or kind of the workhorse of our maintenance vehicles that are out there doing the daily tasks of keeping our road system open. And then our heavy fleet is our 10-yard dump trucks, or graders, plows, those types of things are in our heavy fleet. The recommendation in the report was for us to look at our light and medium fleets that we have. The total replacement value, if we were going to go out and replace our fleet today, about $360 million that we have invested in our fleet. So it's a big component of what we do. We invest about $25 million annually in replacement costs of our fleet. That's not enough to kind of keep up. So just like the rest of our systems, whether it's our pavements, our bridges, so forth, we have deferred maintenance within our fleet. One of probably the biggest issue that we have when we look into this question, and I think when McKinsey did their work, they put a pretty high-level, kind of a quick look at this. And the traditional way you look at fleets is you look at them, how many miles are you using your fleet, and how much utilization do you have of your fleet based on miles driven. A lot of the work that we do with our fleet is not really measured well by that measure. For example, we have our project manager crews out inspecting projects. Their project may only be 5 miles from the office. They drive out to the work site, maybe travel up and down the work site a couple times a day, but that vehicle is their office for the day as they inspect and do their work. Motor carrier, in the similar sense, they take mobile scales out to a site, sit all day, and come back to the office. So a lot of those vehicles don't get a lot of miles, but they get a lot of hours of use. We've tried to do we've done some work to capture those hours, but it's a very labor-intensive, driven process with a lot of room for error in capturing that data. So we have a sense about how many hours our fleet is used, but not really good. When we first got this recommendation, it was similar to what you heard on the facility side. Our first reaction was to hire an expert, come in and do the works. Ironically, or just coincidentally, we received our regular report that we received from DAS, who oversees the light fleet throughout the state, and they gave us several recommendations in their regular review of our light fleet. And one of those is for us to get better data around those hours and as well as mileage. And most fleet enterprises are embedding those telematics inside of vehicles, so it's automatic. You know how many hours, you know how many miles, and it's not a hand-driven, or we're not relying on people filling out different sheets or forms. And we've been doing some of that, but that's going to be critical data as we make this decision. The other thing that we just did in the last year, and this will be the first biennium starting last month, is we're switching to a cost-based rate for our fleet. In other words, in our old system, the fleet was kind of taken off the top, and the crews making decisions on how they utilize their fleet didn't really see the impacts to their budget. Well, we've changed that now to where it's within their budget, and so when they use or not use fleet, those costs are hitting their budgets directly, and they're making those decisions alongside of how much asphalt they're putting down or how much other materials that they're using. And so we will see or anticipate over the next biennium or so and kind of a natural right-sizing of a fleet as those managers make those cost-benefit decisions. We will likely see kind of a natural right-sizing of our fleet. So based on what we saw from DAS, based on what we just changed in this accounting system, there's a lot of things right in front of us we need to do just from a very basic fleet standpoint to get some good data before we bring in some expert to help us really make some better decisions with our fleet. There's a piece of homework we need to do before that. If we did bring the fear is if we brought an expert in now, they basically tell us what we already know, go out there and put telematics in and let this accounting system right-size your fleet naturally before you can get there. So we're going to take kind of a two-step approach to this approach with our fleet is we're going to go back to DASC, or I already have gone back to DASC and asked them to do the same work they did with our light fleet to expand that to our medium fleet to comply with what the McKinsey report did, so we get the same benefit from DAS and get those recommendations. We want to then implement those recommendations from DAS. We want to let this accounting system change, play itself out over the next year, and then we'll come back later in the schedule and bring an expert in to do the analysis once we've done the kind of natural right sizing and have better data for them to give us better recommendation on our fleet. So that's our general approach. We'll still hit the various milestones that are required from DAS. It'll just be kind of in a two-step stage that we'll go through and approach the work.
To this work stream, will we be, I know in our area, we have a resource sharing agreement and we kind of a catalog of, we use this piece of equipment 3 times a year. We think of buying one, but the capital expenditure costs. Will that be a piece of this next phase of looking at our fleet in ways in which, especially in the smaller areas of just maximizing those resources?
Yeah, Chair Bean, we have a lot of those with local communities,
Yes.
especially in rural areas where we'll do striping, we'll do signal maintenance, or vice versa in other areas. We'll have sweeping agreements where whoever owns the sweeper in that community will do sweeping on different parts of the system. So those things will continue, and I think this accounting
process that we have will actually encourage that, and those true costs of that equipment will be really shown in how those equipment are being utilized.
And that'll start as we look for those capital expenditures that maybe, once it hits the budget, that it'll assist in that motivation as well in those discussions. So
Right.
I think that's great. Awesome.
Good.
Just following on that, I'm assuming by your response, what we're going to be able to do better than we've been able to do in the past is articulate the extent to which we are sharing equipment so that the legislature
Right.
understands. I mean, I think periodically we hear, well, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? And actually, we're doing a lot of that already.
Correct.
And being able to articulate that.
Yeah, with
I
the
think
telematics we have, we'll have actual real data and not just rely on, paper and pencil type reports that we get today.
It's back to that risk piece. I think one of the questions, I can't remember if we were in John Day or Baker City, but it was out east, and we asked about, well, do you have formal agreements? And the answer was, well, maybe no, because then you start getting into needing to actually put a lot of that on paper, and really it just is it's an agreement to get things done.
Right.
And I think that's why we hear how the partnership is with ODOT, because we've been able to figure it out in a lot of areas.
Good.
So thank you for that.
Good.
Appreciate your leadership. Okay, do we have other comments or thoughts? All right, thank you very much. And do you need formal action on approving or supporting the management review monthly update?
Yes,
would
Chair
you
Boehner,
like from
I
us?
think the action item is just to accept the progress report,
Okay,
the monthly report.
all right. So I would love a motion for that if you feel inclined.
Madam Chair, I move to approve the monthly update.
All right. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. All right, now on to some major STIP amendments. Turn it over to Mr. Mather again.
Actually, I'm going to have Hal get started on this one. So again, Paul Mather, Highway Division Administrator, here to request approval to add to the 1518 STIP, the Queens Avenue Railroad Crossing in Albany, utilizing some of those federal rail funds that Hal talked about to you earlier. So I'm going to have him go through and just talk about the particular nature of this project and some of the safety issues and how this project will help those.
Okay. Chair Boehner, members of the commission, I'm Hal Gard, I'm the Rail and Public Transit Administrator. Basically, this is a project that's been on our radar for quite some time. Finally, enough funds in region delivery capacity was identified in order for us to move forward with developing it. This is a complicated rail crossing in downtown Albany on a heavily used 4-lane city street. There are bike lanes on both sides of the street that extend, the lanes don't extend across tracks, but they connect on the opposite sides of the track. There are 4 sets of tracks in this area. There's one mainline track, one major siding, and 2 yard tracks, all within the area. Maximum speed on the main line is 40 miles per hour, and for the yard tracks, we're looking at 10 miles per hour. Crossings on the south end of the Portland and Western Albany Yard. The UP uses the main line, and the siding, Portland and Western and Albany Eastern use the yard tracks. UP has 16 freights and 6 passenger rail trains that move through the area a day. And there's a combined 60 freight switching operations within the area. Warning devices for each approach, we have flashing lights, gate, bell, cross buck, do not stop sign, crossing advance warning sign, and of course the crossing advanced pavement crossings. And UP is responsible for maintaining the crossing equipment in the area. Due to the proximity of the yard, the trains are frequently blocking the crossing during the day. And we've had numerous incidents where people are moving around the current gates, including 2 bicycle fatalities within the last 2 years. And basically what happens is the main track is cleared by a train, folks move around it, and they are hit by something coming out of the siding or the yard tracks that they didn't anticipate in the area. The main line track right now is surfaced with a concrete panel, but the other 3 tracks have got old rubberized crossings, and because of the nature of them, it's a Essentially, it's a sloping series of crossings going down. It's a very rough surface. It requires the vehicles to slow as they move through it. It's not grade separatable due to just the geometry. In terms of where that would need to land, it would take up way too much room. Basically, we've looked at other avenues like controlling train movements, and that really isn't possible given the amount of activity in the area. So the proposed upgrades are to upgrade the crossing surface of all 4 tracks to concrete panels and see if there's a way to get some little leveler crossing. Install new flashing lights and gates in all 4 quadrants to make sure that we can prevent the gate runarounds as much as possible. Install sidewalks all the way across the tracks for ease in pedestrian movement, and really to try to deter the pedestrians and bikes from trying to go through the track crossings against the or without the guidance of the sidewalks. We want to install channelized fencing in the sidewalk approaches and along the railroad right-of-way, again, to try to deter pedestrians from moving across the tracks, and install a second train-activated light to let people know that there's additional movements in the area. So that's the project in a nutshell.
Questions?
Chair, the only thing I'll
Please.
add is you'll notice on here, based on my discussion yesterday, and I got stumped by Commissioner Brown's question on other, there's an other funding in this one as well. This is funding that will go towards the work that the railroad will do, specifically with the gates and the part of work actually at the crossing. Just while I'm here to answer the question from yesterday for the other funds on the 205, the $3 million of other funds, similar to this, that $3 million of other funds is for the hardware for the various speed reader board signs and the cameras and so forth. We'll actually go out with a separate contract and buy that ahead of time. The construction project will be for a contractor to install those things. So it shows up in other because there's not another category to put that in. And so, yeah, I knew the answer. I just was stumped in the moment of what that was. So this letter actually has the other explained in it. The letter I had before you yesterday didn't, and so we'll do a better job having that in our letters to explain what other is.
Thank you for coming
Yeah.
back with that. All right, this letter was really comprehensive, so thank you very much. Do we have questions or comments? All right, if not, I would request a motion.
Madam Chair, I move to, that we amend the 2015-18 STIP to add the Queen Avenue Rail Crossing in Albany project.
Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you very
much. All right. Now we have another request, and this is in Region 5, ADA improvements to 395, and, well, actually a series. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Sipp.
Chair Boehne and Commissioners, Craig Sipp, Region 5 Manager. I'm here today to present a SIP amendment for the Region 5 ADA Improvement Project to change the project name to more accurately describe the project to US 395 Emigrant Avenue ADA Improvements, which is in Pendleton, and to increase the funding by $485,000. The project will provide ADA improvements from Southwest 3rd Street to Southwest 9th Street on Immigrant Avenue in Pendleton, a core downtown area that sees heavy pedestrian use. The additional increase in project costs is from our need to meet our ADA obligations that were established after the initial scope of the project. The work is being done as part of our larger statewide obligation to update all curb ramps on our system by 2032. So that's pretty much the project in a nutshell. What it incurred was after we got into it with the ADA requirements that and obligations we now see, we had to keep the project whole, which is very important to us in the community of Pendleton. As we had to expand, we incurred some additional right-of-way and utility costs that wasn't originally scoped as part of the project. Now I can answer any questions you may have at this point.
Oh, I think we anticipated a series of these coming to us, so do we have specific questions? All right, if not, I would welcome a motion.
Madam Chair, I move to amend the 2015-18 STEP program to change the name of Region 5 ADA Improvements Project to US 395 Emigrant Immigrant, just want to make sure. Avenue, ADA improvements.
Excellent. Do we have further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion,
Aye.
motion carries. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have the consent agenda. Director Garrett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a modification to consent calendar item number 3 before I request approval of the overall consent calendar. So I am removing file number 9296-001 regarding the acquisition of real property in Deschutes County for the US 97 Cooley Road project that is listed in the resolution for authority to acquire property. And with that modification, and hearing no concerns or conflicts, I am requesting approval of the remaining items on the consent calendar item as presented.
Okay. Do we have any other conflicts? All right, I would welcome a motion.
Madam Chair, I move approval of the consent calendar items as modified by the director.
Excellent. Further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right, and with that, yes, please, go right ahead.
This is my first road trip, and I truly want to thank not only Craig and Ken for all that they've done for us, but for all of the involvement in Region 5. I'm truly impressed. As I said, I've been involved with the ACT down in the Rogue Valley, but truly impressed with how well you work together. The regional solutions teams projects are amazing, no less than amazing, and I really appreciate everyone that's come together for us. Maybe this is what we see all the time, but again, my first trip, so thank you all very much for making this extremely pleasant. And you know, it's only maybe we need these to be 3 days so that we have the third day to really see where we are, because now I have to plan a trip to come back, which isn't a bad thing. So thank you very, very much for all that you've done to make this a great meeting.
And I could not have said it any better, so thank you for the hospitality. It's great to be here, and thank you for all making time to be with us, and we are adjourned.